All right, well, thanks for having me. Thanks for asking me to discuss these two wonderful papers. I'll admit that I did find it challenging the first time I read through the pair, hopefully because I'm not suffering from cognitive decline, but really because they're so different, as you guys can see. Is that one paper is really more about kind of what do we know about the way the world is right now, and the other one is more theoretical model, and it's like what should be, or what, really I would say, what could be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the papers in turn, and I'm going to start with the way that they were presented. I'm just going to offer some thoughts that I had on both of the papers. And with the 7 life priorities, I'm just going to kind of go real quickly through the things that they discuss and start kind of the way they did it. Health, clearly very important. The entire morning session was focused on health and the issues around health. This is an area that I think the surveys could really dive a lot deeper into, mainly because there's lots of uncertainty, right, about people's current perceptions of their health and their future perceptions of their health, not just as a single person, but as a joint, as a family decision. We know there's the potential for catastrophic costs that can have a big impact, not just on finances, but on other family members. We do have this 80-20 factoid that health costs aren't evenly distributed over retired life. They're relatively low up until the last 2 or 3 years, and then they're really, really big. And I found it really interesting to think about how people might want to think about leveraging home in financing healthcare costs, in particular as someone who's just recently gone through this with some aging in-laws, is that home healthcare can be really, really expensive, and people don't have a really good idea about what it actually means. A good friend of mine who is English says the English system will provide home healthcare. What that means is you get 1 hour of home healthcare a day. And it's not 1 complete hour, it's in 15-minute buckets. And you don't know when the person's going to show up, right? So that can be very, very challenging to get that kind of public support. And so I think this is an area. So I think, again, the other thing I'd say that's kind of correlated with what you do is that what role should the extended family play, or even the kind of the nuclear family, the children or grandchildren? And one of the things that we do know that when younger family members do play a role is overwhelmingly women. And so that can lead to kind of intergenerational problems with wealth accumulation and finance and stuff like that. And how should those burdens, should people be planning? I think it'd be great for these types of surveys. Do you plan to rely on family members to help with this stuff as you move forward? The last thing I'd say about this, again, in planning for healthcare, and this is some work I'm just starting with Bob Clark, is how do people plan to finance their out-of-pocket healthcare costs? If people can expect these kind of expenditures, there was a lot of discussions about annuities earlier today. Should people be trying to plan into, the Treasury's trying to encourage people to take deferred life annuities. Now with the QLACs, should people be building those into their retirement plans so that they are less of a burden on their family by having a steady source of income to help pay for those costs? The second thing, you talked about home, and home is also very, very important. The big thing I find when I talk to people about retirement planning and stuff like this is what role will the home play in your life? Right? And one of the big things that we're noticing in our own research when we're looking at kind of demographics is what's going on that we find somewhat troubling, is that while the proportion of people who have paid off their home by the time they move in retirement looks high in the mid-70s, it's actually a historic low, right? I mean, this is a number of more and more people are moving into retirement still owing significant amounts on a property. This is a problem because this is the difference between needing 80 to 100% replacement ratio in retirement, because you still got to pay for house, and needing 40 to 50%. I can very easily run simulations where if you've paid off the house, you've pre-funded all that consumption, that's a great source of retirement consumption that is pre-funded. I can get you down to 40, 50%, which can take a lot of pressure off other parts of the budget. The other thing I'd say is, it may be in here, you guys present a lot of data that went in the paper that I received, but it seems like it's maybe all out there, is that, again, I'd think about getting perceptions on the role of reverse mortgages. My own view of these is they tend to be terrible products. They're kind of the last source of funds, and I think it's because the way that they're priced are not very, very attractive, but they can be there. But again, it kind of falls into other areas where I think you could do a lot of interesting cross correlations of looking into things such as, estate planning, right? If you want to leave an estate, for many people, the biggest part of that estate is going to be the home. Family support. I think you guys presented some really interesting data on the family bank. I think everybody knows somebody like that. Maybe hopefully you're not that person. Maybe you like being that person. And I think that's an important thing, is that some people like being the family bank. There are typically some strings attached with being the family bank, right? But again, I would say is this, I think you could enrich the survey by saying, is this more of a like or a need? Do you like being that person, or do you need to be that person? And again, it's the intergenerational family linkage. But what I'd also find interesting is that, are there reverse linkages? Do you have kids giving money to parents, right? Those transfers can go both ways. And what we see is, in particular with the boomers who you're studying, you hear them calls like, well, we're the sandwich generation. I have to take care of my parents and my kids, right? Well, and they, like boomers usually do, they like to think that they're unique, but they're not. But I think that's more of a traditional family relationship in most of the world. And it has been a traditional family relationship in most of the U.S. up until the baby boomers came along. And I think we're just kind of coming back to that. You guys do touch on this, and I think it's really interesting. I think there are a lot of complicating factors today around how blended families work. And if you do have someone that's a family bank, it can lead to some very complicated discussions about, well, whose checking account is the money coming out of? Does it come out of a joint account? It'd be interesting just to know a little bit more about the kind of those pressures that we see from people. Work, you guys do a lot of good work in here. I think there's a lot of, they do a really good job on this. I think they raise an interesting question about what it means to be retired, because people tend to choose to go back to work. I do think you can dig a little bit deeper on the 80-20 about people wanting to go back to work, and really digging into that and saying, well, you know, a question you could ask in a certain way is like, well, if you didn't work, could you live the way that you are right now? Right? Because people may tell you they work because they enjoy it, but I suspect there's a lot more people working because they want the money, right? And they enjoy having the money. But it is true. I don't think this is necessarily true for the boomers as it was for our parents. That my dad, as an example, and people give anecdotes here, is that my dad was a guy who was defined by what he did for a living. That was it. He was terrified of retirement because he would no longer be defined. Right? He was terrified of it because he had no real hobbies. He just liked to work. You guys kind of turn that on its head a little bit because you show that people really, really do enjoy that leisure. So you really see that classical, neoclassical model that leisure's disutility is not really necessarily true. And finally, with giving, again, time versus money, I think you've got some interesting correlations here that you could look at. For example, if people have paid off their home, are they more likely to give money? I think there are big tax incentives to do that. I think one of the issues with the tax code right now, that why people are carrying mortgages into retirement, there's a big tax advantage to it. Otherwise, you go on to the standard deduction and you may have a much bigger tax bill, but you can offset that with that by giving. All right, so now I'm going to move on to when to delegate, because I know I'm running out of time. This is also a great paper. I really enjoyed it. It asks some very important questions, I think, for the overall advice industry. I would put it this way, and you kind of hit it at the end, and I talked to Raymond a little bit about this. This is really a paper about, does advice generate alpha? And not in the way we typically think about it, of excess market returns over the general market. But the benchmark here is not the market. The benchmark here is over yourself, right? And it's a great question to ask. Is it worth money for me to pay someone to do this for me because they can generate enough extra return that I'm going to be better off? And they come up with the unqualified answer that it's yes, across 3 different dimensions. Human interaction, right? In-person, customized, highly customized advice. Robo-advisors, which you weren't able to get to, but they talk about the role of robo-advisors and these default target date funds. So the thing about it is they find that this is true on average, and so I'm going to offer some suggestions here, and I have a few questions as well. First one I have is what they use to kind of benchmark their simulation or average advisor fees in the market. And what I'd say is I think this is an area that would benefit a lot from some sensitivity analysis. For example, is the median significantly different from the average would be a starting place, right? Because we know that these fees tend to be pretty lumpy. Again, a paper that Bob and I wrote years ago where we looked at individual purchase 403B markets, the fees were all over the place. When you had really low cost ones, you had really high costs. And so I suspect if you did that type of sensitivity analysis of looking more at the tails, you'd find that you could generate even more alpha with low-cost in-person advice, what I'm calling alpha, and you'd probably lose money with the high cost. And I think this is where you get into kind of the regulatory environment with labor and stuff like that, where they want to try to get rid of these bad actors on this end of the distribution and keep everybody else. So let's see. The second thing I'd say is I thought it would be really interesting, and I'm sure you can do this, is that if you can decompose the gains when I was reading the paper between the improved investment portfolio performance and actually the cost of what people are paying for, right? And because I didn't quite understand what was driving it. I think when you say that robo-advice is actually better than in-person advice, that's being completely driven by the fact that the robo-advice is cheaper. And that's the only thing that's different. But I think that's also a limitation of the model, as is target date funds, and here's why. Is I'm a strong believer that target date funds are good for everyone on average, but no one in particular, right? But because of that, they're a great default, and especially for people early in their career, where differences in outcomes aren't that important, right? Getting it slightly wrong early in your career, even though there's a lifetime compounding effect, isn't that important. But as people age, they have kids, they buy houses, they get more education. What we do know about retirement outcomes is why defaults are very, very difficult, is that heterogeneity matters a lot as you approach retirement. People have very, very different life circumstances. And so understanding a little bit more about that would be very helpful. The other thing I'd say is you guys model developing financial expertise as a substitute for other things. But there could have complementary effects. And so it'd be interesting to say if it was, so it's kind of a perfect substitute. Now I either do this or that. But what if I'm really good at betting on the ponies, right? Can I not use that kind of skill to help me make decisions on betting? Or then you presented the evidence about people picking out a TV. In a certain sense, picking out a TV and doing that research is not really that much different than researching mutual funds. It's just a different set of information. The last thing I'd say about this is considering inertia. I'm never really quite sure. I've read a lot of these papers over the time about what people mean by inertia, but anybody that works in the retirement planning industry knows that a lot of inertia is caused by the structure of the plan itself, right? There are big limitations on the number of times that you can churn the portfolio in a quarter and a year, right? Which is going to, so a lot of people might not be because they're disinterested or they don't know. It might just, they just don't feel like it's worth it it's not really inertia in the sense I think you mean it. And the other thing I say about this is that market timing is very, very difficult with mutual funds in general, right? Because of the way they're valued. You know, if you might see the market tanking early in the morning and you say, oh, I got to get out of the S&P, and then by the afternoon it's up 200 points, right? And so but you've already made that trade. So market timing I think is very, so I think when we think about inertia, it works really well for like brokerage accounts. And I would wonder if you could actually, if anyone's ever done a study on this, I'm not familiar with it, is looking at people that actually hold both to see the kind of the relative trading between brokerage accounts and their retirement plans. I guarantee the brokerage accounts, you're going to see a lot less inertia there. Okay, so I'm out of time, so I'm going to finish on try to pull these things together, these two papers together, and I try to always pull these things together, and I say I'm going to talk about three things, and it's my 3 H's that I learned from these papers. It's one, first H is help. People need help, right? Average household, average retiree, average person needs help with this, and not just financial help. A lot of this is around life planning, contingency planning, and stuff like that. How should we deliver that help? The second H is heterogeneity, which I mentioned already. People are different, and these differences grow more pronounced as they get older. And I think this is why defaults are very, very difficult for retirement distributions. And literally, there was a discussion this morning, you can't do it with annuities. Because one thing about a default is you have to be able to get out of it, right? So with the current defaults on the accumulation phase, if I don't like the target date fund, every 90 days my employer's got to give me, I can get out of it. You can't do that with annuities. Once I turn over the asset, you basically lose it. So if you can come up with a clever way of overcoming that liquidity issue, let us know because we're very interested in that TIA. And the last one I'm going to say is hubris. I hear a lot of hubris around here that people are dumb. They just don't know better. And it's all based on the fact that people aren't, and you kind of reach this, they don't behave like my model says they should. And there seems to be this movement right now towards the idea that somehow that impersonal target date funds or robo-advice, which is just really a refinement of a target date funds because you're still going to be putting about 10 different buckets, are somehow better than in-person advice, right? And I tend to reject that. And I think it's because people believe in the strength of these models. But you can think about the principal agent problem with Bernie Madoff on this hand, or I can think about the principal agent problem with long-term capital management and the housing crisis on this hand. These were both model-driven, right, by people believing that the infallibility of their models and large, huge systemic shocks. And so I'll stop there and leave it to other people.